In 2003, archaeologists discovered human remains at the Minagawa limestone quarry in Okinawa. Standard procedure, nothing unusual. They ran the DNA tests, expecting to confirm what everyone already believed about Japanese ancestry. The results came back impossible. The genetic markers didn't match modern Japanese populations. They didn't match ancient Jomon people. They didn't match any population in mainland Asia. They didn't match anyone, anywhere, in the entire genetic database. After 2 decades of research, scientists still can't explain where these people came from or what happened to them. If you're interested in the mysteries hiding inside human DNA and the stories that rewrite everything we thought we knew about ancient migration, hit subscribe. I cover new discoveries in genetics and archaeology every week. The story of Japan's genetic mystery starts with what seemed like a solved case. For over a century, the accepted narrative was clean and simple. Around 35,000 years ago, the first people arrived in Japan during the Ice Age, crossing land bridges from the Asian mainland. These were the Jomon people, Japan's original inhabitants. They lived as hunter-gatherers for thousands of years, developing a unique culture known for elaborate pottery. The Jomon created some of the oldest pottery in the world, with designs so intricate they suggested a sophisticated aesthetic tradition. They built settlements along coastlines, harvested shellfish, hunted deer and wild boar, and developed a stable society that lasted over 10,000 years. Then, around 3,000 years ago, rice farmers from the Korean peninsula began arriving. These were the Yayoi people. They brought agriculture, metallurgy, and new genetic lineages. They introduced wet rice cultivation, bronze and iron tools, and fundamentally transformed Japanese society within a few centuries. Over time, the Jomon and Yayoi populations mixed, creating the genetic foundation of modern Japanese people. Simple, linear, settled science. Every textbook in Japan taught this dual structure model. Academic conferences reinforced it. Museum exhibits displayed it. Researchers moved on to other questions. But the Minagawa remains shattered that clean narrative. The bones dated to approximately 20,000 years ago, placing them firmly in the late Paleolithic period, thousands of years before the Jomon culture even existed. The excavation site itself was remarkable. The limestone quarry had preserved the remains in exceptional condition, protected from the degradation that destroys most ancient DNA. When geneticists extracted and sequenced the DNA, the process was painstaking. They worked in sterile laboratories wearing full protective suits to prevent contamination. They drilled tiny samples from the densest parts of the bones, usually the petrous portion of the temporal bone near the inner ear, where DNA preservation is best. The extraction process took weeks. First, they ground the bone into powder. Then they used chemical solutions to break down the bone matrix and release whatever DNA fragments remained. What they found should not exist. The mitochondrial HLO groups, the genetic signatures passed down through maternal lines for thousands of generations, were unlike anything in the reference databases. These weren't minor variations. These weren't distant cousins. These were genetic signatures from a lineage that had split from other Asian populations tens of thousands of years earlier. They weren't related to modern Japanese populations. They weren't related to Jomon descendants found in new communities or Okinawan populations. They weren't related to ancient samples from Korea, China, Mongolia, or anywhere else in East Asia. The researchers ran the sequences through every database available. Nothing matched. They compared them to indigenous populations from Siberia, Southeast Asia, even Australia, and the Pacific Islands. Still nothing. The genetic distance was so significant that these people represented a completely separate lineage, a ghost population. This discovery triggered something researchers called the ancient DNA revolution. For decades, studying ancient populations meant analyzing bones, tools, and physical features. Skulls were measured using calipers and complex mathematical formulas designed to determine racial classifications, methods we now recognize as fundamentally flawed. Anthropologists would examine cranial shapes, jaw structures, tooth morphology, anything that might hint at relationships between ancient populations. Migration patterns were guessed from pottery styles. If two sites had similar ceramics, researchers assumed the people were related. If stone tools looked alike, they theorized about shared techniques passed down through generations or contact between distant groups. The science was educated guesswork at best, speculation at worst. Academic careers were built on interpretations of artifact distributions. Then, in the early 2000s, technology advanced enough to extract and sequence DNA from ancient remains. The first successful sequencing of Neanderthal DNA in 1997 proved the concept was possible. By 2003, laboratories could extract DNA from bones thousands of years old. By 2010, they could sequence entire genomes. Suddenly, researchers could read genetic code written 10,000, 20,000, even 50,000 years ago. The data started revealing that human migration wasn't a simple story of one group replacing another. It was a tangled web of mixing, splitting, disappearing, and reappearing populations. Groups that seemed unrelated based on archaeology turned out to be closely connected genetically. Populations assumed to be direct ancestors of modern people turned out to be evolutionary dead ends. Every new ancient DNA sample risked overturning decades of accepted history. The Mintowawa discovery was only the beginning. As more laboratories across Japan gained the capability to sequence ancient DNA, they began testing everything they could find. Bones stored in museum collections for decades were suddenly valuable again. Specimens that had been cataloged, photographed, and filed away in climate-controlled storage rooms that were brought out for reanalysis. Burial sites that had been excavated in the 1960s and 1970s, documented with handwritten notes and black-and-white photographs, were reopened with modern techniques. Between 2003 and 2018, researchers tested remains from over 40 different archaeological sites spanning 30,000 years of Japanese prehistory. They established strict protocols to prevent contamination. Ancient samples were handled only in dedicated clean rooms. Researchers wore sterile suits, gloves, and masks. Every tool was sterilized. Every surface was cleaned with UV light. The risk of modern DNA contaminating ancient samples was enormous, and a single contaminated result could invalidate months of work. What they found was even stranger than the original Minotogawa samples. Japan wasn't populated by two groups. It was populated by at least 4 distinct genetic lineages, and possibly more. Some lineages overlapped in time, but showed no signs of interbreeding. Others appeared, flourished for a few thousand years, and then vanished completely from the genetic record. Each lineage arrived at different times from different source populations and carried genetic signatures that didn't match any modern group. The first ghost population was the Mintowawa lineage, dating to 20,000 years ago. The second appeared in samples from Hiro, another Okinawan site dating to around 3,000 years ago. The Hiro remains showed genetic markers related to Austronesian populations from Taiwan and the Philippines, populations that supposedly never reached Japan. According to traditional archaeological models, the third ghost population emerged from German period remains in Hokkaido. These samples showed unexpected genetic connections to ancient populations in the Russian Far East and parts of Siberia. But the specific haplogroups didn't match any known modern group. The fourth appeared in Yayoi period samples from southern Kyushu. The genetic profile suggested mixing between Jomon and a mainland Asian population, but not the Korean lineages everyone expected. The source population appeared to have come from somewhere in southern China or Southeast Asia, a migration route no one had proposed. Each discovery created more questions than answers. If these populations existed, where did they go? Why don't modern Japanese people carry these genetic signatures? Were they completely replaced? Did they die out from disease? Did they mix so thoroughly with later arrivals that their unique markers were diluted beyond detection? The researchers needed more data. They needed ancient DNA from all across the Japanese archipelago, from every time period. They needed to map the genetic landscape of Japan across 30,000 years. That meant testing hundreds of samples. It meant coordinating between universities, museums, and government agencies. It meant developing new extraction techniques for DNA that was degraded, contaminated, or embedded in bones that had been handled improperly for decades. The project expanded. By 21, the Kanazawa University Ancient DNA Lab, led by Professor Takashi Gakuhari, had sequenced DNA from over 70 ancient individuals, spanning from the Paleolithic to the medieval period. The dataset was massive. The patterns that emerged were even more complex than anyone anticipated. The genetic map showed waves of migration, but not in straight lines. Populations moved back and forth across the Sea of Japan. Groups that arrived early didn't simply stay in one place. They moved, split, merged, and sometimes vanished entirely. The Mintoawa lineage appeared in Okinawa 20,000 years ago, but disappeared by 15,000 years ago. No descendants, no genetic trace in later populations. They were there, and then they weren't. The Jon people weren't a single homogeneous group either. DNA samples from northern Japan showed different genetic signatures than samples from southern Japan. Jomon populations in Hokkaido had more genetic affinity with ancient populations from the Russian Far East. Jomon populations in Kyushu showed faint genetic connections to populations in southern China. The Jan weren't one people. They were at least 3 or 4 genetically distinct groups that archaeologists had lumped together because their pottery styles looked similar. The unified Jomon culture was an illusion created by looking at artifacts instead of genes. Then came the Yayoi findings. The narrative everyone learned in school was that rice farmers from Korea arrived around 3,000 years ago and mixed with the Jon. The DNA data showed this was partially true, but missing half the story. Yes, there was a major migration from the Korean peninsula, but there were also simultaneous migrations from southern China, possibly from the Yangtze River Delta region. These groups brought different agricultural techniques, different languages, and different genetic lineages. They didn't arrive as one unified wave. They came in multiple smaller migrations over a 1,000-year period. Some settled in northern Kyushu. Others went directly to the Kinki region near modern-day Osaka. Some even bypassed Kyushu entirely and landed on the western coast of Honshu. The Yayoi period wasn't a simple blending of two populations. It was a genetic mixing event involving at least 4 or 5 distinct source groups. The mystery deepened when researchers compared ancient Japanese DNA to modern populations across Asia. They expected to find clear matches with Chinese, Korean, or Siberian groups. They found something else. The ancient Japanese samples showed genetic components that existed nowhere in modern Asian populations. There were unique HLO groups that had completely disappeared from the modern gene pool. It was as if entire branches of the human family tree had been cut off. These weren't just rare genetic variants that became uncommon. These were lineages that went extinct. The populations carrying them were either completely replaced or absorbed so thoroughly that their genetic signatures were erased. One hypothesis emerged to explain the ghost populations: climate change. Around 20,000 years ago, during the last glacial maximum, Japan was connected to the Asian mainland by land bridges. Sea levels were over 100 meters lower than today. The continental shelf that's now underwater was dry land. What is now the Sea of Japan was a series of inland lakes and rivers surrounded by grasslands and forests. The Tsushima Strait between Korea and Japan didn't exist. You could walk from Busan to Fukuoka without seeing ocean. In the north, Hokkaido was connected to Sakhalin and the Siberian mainland. Migration was easy. Multiple populations spread across these land bridges, each adapted to different environments. Coastal groups specialized in fishing and shellfish gathering. Inland groups hunted Ice Age megapod. Then, around 15,000 years ago, the Ice Age ended. Temperatures rose, glaciers melted. Sea levels began rising rapidly. Within 5,000 years, sea levels had risen by over 100 meters. Coastlines moved inland by dozens of kilometers. The land bridges disappeared. The populations became isolated on islands. Small, isolated populations are vulnerable. Genetic diversity drops. Inbreeding increases. Disease can wipe out entire groups. When the Jomon culture began consolidating around 14,000 years ago, it's possible they absorbed, out-competed, or simply outlasted these earlier populations. The Minogawa people might have been victims of rising sea levels and isolation, not conflict or disease. But that hypothesis has problems. If isolation and small population size caused extinctions, why did some John groups survive and others didn't? Why do some ghost populations appear after the sea level rise, not before? The Hirota remains from Okinawa date to 3,000 years ago, long after the Ice Age ended. These people arrived by boat, not land bridges. They represented an intentional maritime migration from Taiwan or the Philippines. They established communities, lived for generations, and then vanished from the genetic record. No modern Okinawans carry their lineage. What happened to them? Were they killed? Did they leave? Did they integrate so completely that their unique markers disappeared? The archaeological record shows no signs of mass conflict. There are no burn layers, no mass graves, no sudden abandonment of settlements. They just stopped appearing in the DNA. Another hypothesis focuses on disease. When agricultural populations from mainland Asia began arriving during the Yayoi period, they brought new pathogens that hunter-gatherer populations had never encountered. Farming communities live in closer proximity to domesticated animals. Pigs, chickens, cattle, and dogs all harbor diseases that can jump to humans. Smallpox likely came from cattle. Measles evolved from rinderpest. Influenza originated in pigs and birds. Agricultural societies develop resistance over generations, but populations with no prior exposure have no immunity. When Europeans arrived in the Americas after 1492, diseases killed up to 90% of indigenous populations within a century. Entire cities were abandoned. Complex civilizations collapsed. Could something similar have happened in Japan? Could the ghost populations have been wiped out by waves of disease carried by Yayoi migrants arriving from Korea and China? The theory fits some of the data. The Minotaugua lineage disappears around the same time the John culture begins consolidating. The Hiro lineage disappears shortly after the Yayoi period begins in Okinawa. Timing matches, but there's no direct evidence. No ancient remains showing lesions characteristic of epidemic disease. No genetic markers indicating immune system responses, just absence. Populations that were there and then weren't. The third hypothesis is the most unsettling: deliberate replacement. The Yayoi migration wasn't peaceful integration, it was colonization. The new arrivals didn't mix with existing populations. They displaced them, pushed them out, took their land. The archaeological record in northern Kyushu shows rapid change during the Yayoi period. Jomon settlements disappear. Yayoi settlements appear in their place. The transition happens in less than 200 years. A blink in archaeological time. That's not gradual mixing, that's replacement. If the Yayoi replaced the Jon in some regions, they could have replaced the ghost populations too. The genetics would support this. If a population is completely replaced, their DNA disappears. No descendants means no genetic trace. The absence of violence in the archaeological record doesn't disprove this. Most conflicts don't leave evidence in the ground. Population displacement can happen through economic pressure, resource competition, or social exclusion. You don't need mass graves to erase a population from history. Whatever the cause, the ghost populations are gone. Their DNA survives only in fragments extracted from ancient bones. The people who carried those genes left no descendants. Their languages are lost. Their cultures are forgotten. They existed for thousands of years, and then they were erased so completely that until 2003, no one even knew they had been there. The Minagawa discovery revealed that Japan's genetic history isn't a story of continuity. It's a story of extinction and replacement, of populations rising and disappearing, of diversity collapsing into the lineages we see today. The implications go far beyond Japan. If ghost populations existed in Japan, they likely existed elsewhere. How many human lineages have vanished without a trace? How many times has our species experienced genetic bottlenecks we don't know about? Ancient DNA research is still in its infancy. We've only been able to reliably extract and sequence ancient DNA for about 20 years. Most of the world's archaeological sites haven't been tested. Most ancient remains excavated before the year 2000 were never analyzed for DNA because the technology didn't exist. Museums around the world hold millions of specimens that could potentially reveal ghost populations. Most ancient remains don't preserve DNA well enough to sequence. Hot, humid climates destroy DNA within centuries. Acidic soils dissolve bones and leach out genetic material. Only in cold, dry environments does DNA survive for tens of thousands of years. The samples we have are biased toward cold climates where DNA degrades slowly. Northern Europe, Siberia, high-altitude caves. We know far more about the genetic history of Scandinavia than Southeast Asia, more about Siberian populations than equatorial Africa. We're seeing a tiny fraction of the full picture. Every new sample has the potential to reveal another ghost population, another extinct lineage, another missing chapter in human history. Recent discoveries are proving this. In 2023, researchers in the Philippines found DNA from a previously unknown hominin species, the Denisvan, in the genome of modern indigenous populations. No one knew denizens had reached Southeast Asia. The only evidence was a few genetic markers inherited by people living today. In Siberia, ancient DNA revealed a population called the ancient North Eurasians that existed 24,000 years ago and contributed DNA to Native Americans, Europeans, and Central Asians, but then disappeared completely as a distinct group. In India, genetic analysis uncovered evidence of a ghost population that mixed with the ancestors of modern South Asians, but left no other trace. These populations existed, thrived, and vanished. The only reason we know they were real is because fragments of their DNA survived. The Japanese ghost populations might be the most thoroughly documented case of genetic extinction we have. The data is extensive, the timeline is clear, the archaeological context is well preserved. Researchers can track the arrival, persistence, and disappearance of multiple lineages across 30,000 years. The mystery isn't whether these populations existed, it's what happened to them. The answer might be climate, it might be disease, it might be violence, or it might be something else entirely. A combination of factors that created conditions where small, isolated populations couldn't survive, where genetic diversity collapsed, where the wrong mutation, the wrong harvest failure, the wrong storm could end a lineage that had survived for 10,000 years. The Minagawa people lived on Okinawa for at least 5,000 years. 5,000 years is an incomprehensibly long time. That's longer than recorded history. That's longer than agriculture has existed in most parts of the world. They survived the end of the Ice Age, one of the most dramatic climate shifts in recent geological history. They survived sea level rise that transformed their world from connected mainland to isolated island. They adapted to changing coastlines, changing ecosystems, changing resources. They developed tools, culture, social structures sophisticated enough to allow them to thrive for millennia. They buried their dead with care, placing bodies in specific positions, sometimes with grave goods, suggesting complex beliefs about death and the afterlife, about what it meant to be human and what happened after life ended. They were fully human in every way that matters. They loved. They raised children. They told stories. They looked at the same stars we see and wondered what they meant. And then they were gone. Not in a catastrophic event we can point to. Not in a plague that left mass graves. Not in a war that left burned settlements. They faded. Their population shrank generation by generation. Maybe the young people had fewer children. Maybe infant mortality increased. Maybe food became scarce. Maybe they integrated with other groups and lost their distinct identity. We don't know. What we know is that their lineage ended, the genetic line that connected them to their ancestors going back hundreds of thousands of years. The unbroken chain of parents and children stretching back to Africa to the origin of our species. That line broke. Their bones are in museums now, carefully labeled and stored in climate-controlled rooms. Their DNA is in databases reduced to strings of letters representing genetic sequences. But their descendants are nowhere. The lineage that started somewhere in deep prehistory, that migrated across continents and survived ice ages and climate shifts, and all the challenges that come with being human in a world that doesn't care if you survive. That lineage ended on a limestone island in the Pacific. No war, no plague, no dramatic ending. Just silence. Just the slow reduction of a population until one day there weren't enough of them left to continue. This is what ancient DNA research reveals. History isn't a smooth progression from past to present. It's a series of extinctions and survivals. Some lineages make it, others don't. The genetic diversity we see today is a shadow of what existed 20,000 years ago. Dozens of human populations are missing. Their genes didn't make it to the modern world. They left no trace except fragments in bones. Japan's ghost populations are a reminder that survival isn't guaranteed. Being human isn't enough. You need luck. You need the right environment. You need to avoid the wrong diseases, the wrong conflicts, the wrong century. The Minagawa people didn't get lucky. Neither did the hero lineage. Neither did the unnamed populations from Hokkaido and Kyushu. They lived, and then they ended. What we're left with are questions. Who were the Minagawa people? Where did they come from before they reached Okinawa? Did they have language, art, stories? What did they call themselves? We'll never know. The DNA tells us they existed, but it can't tell us who they were. Their identity is lost. Their voice is silent. All we have are the bones and the genetic code locked inside and the uncomfortable knowledge that they're not unique. They're part of a pattern of populations rising and falling, of genetic lineages blinking into existence and then vanishing. The map of human history is full of gaps. The Japanese ghost populations filled in a few of those gaps, but for every question they answered, they created 10 more. The research continues. Laboratories across Japan are testing more samples. New extraction techniques are improving DNA recovery from degraded remains. Researchers are expanding databases, looking for connections to populations in Siberia, China, Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines. Maybe they'll find matches. Maybe they'll find more ghost populations. Either way, the story of Japan's ancestry is far from settled. Every new sample has the potential to rewrite it again. That's the future of ancient DNA research. Not answers, but better questions. Not certainty, but deeper mystery. The Minagawa discovery taught us that we don't know our own history as well as we thought. That populations we never knew existed once walked the same ground we walk today. That their DNA locked in ancient bones is the only proof they were ever real. And that absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Just because we haven't found something doesn't mean it wasn't there. The Japanese archipelago held its secrets for 20,000 years. How many more secrets are still buried, waiting for someone to dig them up and read the code written in bone? Next week, I'm covering the recent discovery of Neanderthal DNA in unexpected modern populations, and what that tells us about interbreeding we didn't know happened. If you want to stay updated on the latest genetics research that's rewriting human history, subscribe now. And if you're interested in other ancient migration mysteries, the video on screen breaks down the genetic evidence for a lost population that crossed the Pacific 5,000 years before Polynesians. Click it.